Did you watch that video? Was it Jagmeet Singh? Am I saying his name right?
Yeah, Jagmeet Singh. He's the leader of the NDP.
I've been fascinated by this video of him confronting these two dudes. You know what video I'm talking about?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
Oh my
that was
God. These two white dudes, for those that haven't seen, these two white dudes that are like Canada MAGA people. What do you call them in Canada? What do you call them?
they're just like conservatives. You know what I mean? Like
Let's
right
just say
wingers.
conservative. You don't call
Yeah,
them like what would the trucker convoy crowd or anything? You don't have a name for
the
them.
trucker people. That was a weird movement because the trucker was like a mixture of like hard right people, moderate right
Mhm.
people, and like libertarians, and actually Green Party anti-vaxxer hippie people. It was a really weird thing.
Oh, just like Occupy. Well, so there are these two guys, and they're obviously conservatives. And one shout, I can't remember exactly what he shouted at him, but he shouted something at Singh. And it's so funny because dude, he keeps walking after the dude shouts it. And then some clicks and he goes, no, fuck this. And he turns around. And he turns around and walks up like I'm about to fuck somebody up. And he walks right to one of the dudes. He goes, what did you say to me? Say it again. What did you say to me? And then the guy snitches out his friend. Yeah, he goes, and he snitches out his friend next to him. The guy goes, I didn't say anything. Maybe someone else over there said it. And he does this with his head where he motions to the side and then points to his friend. And the friend goes, and then Jagmeet gets into the friend's face and goes, hey, what did you say? And he's putting his finger right in the guy's face. And the guy just sits there and denies it in front of him. And that's when Singh makes the adult decision to not hit him. I believe if that man would have said, yeah, I said it, he was going to punch him. Because if you look at him and you look how tense Singh was getting, he was about to punch dude. He looks kind of like he works out.
So that's the thing about Jagmeet Singh. One, he has an MMA background. Like he did Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu. So he can fight, he can spar. And he's also from Scarborough.
Hood.
Yeah, kind of like he's from like the part of Scarborough where it's like lower income ethnic communities. It's like Drake's made a few lines about like, oh, my boy's from Scarborough.
Oh, Jesus Christ, Drake. Hey, the way he walked up on Homeboy, it made me so proud. I don't know why, because I'm sure there's times when you see certain comments, you're like, I bet that bitch wouldn't say it in my face. Because I saw, what's the guy's, Hassan Piker? His like whole life is like streaming. And I saw some clip of something where he was at a restaurant doing a stream and some guy walked by him and said, Destiny made you. Like, I would have grabbed that guy and be like, say it again. Like, first of all, you don't fucking know me. And second of all, don't do that. Because now you're dealing with the actual person and I will slap the shit out of you. Feel nothing to slap the shit out of you. So then there's that aspect of it too. Like, do people feel comfortable to say fucked up shit to you if they don't agree with what you say? But I feel like you don't really live in that controversial space where you're like calling other shows out, but you don't do that. So I can't think of anybody.
Like I have a few haters, but they're like the type of people who would stay only on Twitter, you know? Like
you're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am joined by Jason Myles, the writer, musician, and rock star from the band called Bitter Lake. Some of you may know Jason from the podcast called This Is Revolution, a fantastic show that I have been on recently to talk about the topic of contained opposition or controlled opposition. And I totally get why you had me on that show to talk about that particular topic. I was kind of confused at the time why you chose that, but after reading your latest book that you published, a short pamphlet called I Was a Teenage Anarchist, I totally see why, because it deals with very similar themes. We're going to talk about a lot of those themes today, which are more broadly going to be the punk rock scene and the relation between punk rock culture and leftist radicalism, two worlds which you've both been in. So you have a unique perspective of being both an OG in the punk rock scene and being highly immersed in socialist politics in America. So I'm curious when these two worlds overlapped for you, or if they were both always part of your life, and by extension, what made you want to write this book, which connects punk rock culture to the contemporary left?
Thank you for that question. Just a little background on myself. I played music for years. I still do play it. I don't get to play out with the band anymore, so it's just me recording music in my place in Mexico. So there's a big difference. It's not as heavy as what I was once able to do, but I still do it. But I lived for years in a music rehearsal and recording studio in West Oakland, California called Soundwave Studios. And in that place, I kind of got the perfect nightmare and a dream come true scenario. It's a warehouse you weren't supposed to live in, so there's that. There's huge rats and all the problems that you have living in a warehouse with shared bathrooms and all this other crap. But I did get to live amongst a lot of my musical heroes, regardless of genre. And in doing that was kind of the birthplace for the idea of even the podcast, because I always wanted to do something where I can interview these guys, because we would have these great conversations. You know, there were, I don't want to name drop, but there was just like a lot of really cool, influential bands that I was constantly around that I got to just pick their brains for years. And the longer I talked to these guys, a facade kind of went away from me. And there was this facade of when I was a kid listening to like California Uber Alice and London Calling and all these songs that I thought were the most political, radical things ever, even, hip hop stuff like Fight the Power and stuff. It was really rare to meet a music radical. The only person, and this isn't a knock on anybody, it's just more of an observation. The only person I can say that has radical politics in their art and in their life that I actually got to know pretty well was Boots Riley. Boots Riley. He's not dead. He still goes out to protest. He still organizes. He is one of the most intelligent, insightful, helpful people in any industry. And he's about as quote unquote real as it gets on a mainstream level. And even then still, he fights to get anything done. I don't know if you saw the movie Sorry to Bother You or his series on Amazon, I'm a Virgo, but his movies don't really end in this way that I think a lot of the anti-capitalism stuff ends, in this like Tina, there is no alternative and this is just what it is, so let's complain and watch another of these harrowing tales of people killing each other to survive in this effed off system. Sorry for the sounds of the city behind me if you can hear it. So that was kind of the impetus to write the piece, and it really kicked off for me work in the podcast world, because I saw so much of the same stuff that I saw in the music world, culture-wise, these cultures of authenticity and deconstruction, where there's a lot of people that just want to tear everything down without really a plan. They have real generic ideas of what they think revolution is based off of, the great marketing of the culture industry. And there's a culture of authenticity that I think is very similar to what I saw in the music world, where everything is like hyper individualized. I'm not just a leftist, I'm a Marxist, thisist, I'm a this or that and this from generation, blah, blah, blah. So everybody thinks like a marketing person. There's a lot of marketing talk, generational speak, and I speak for this kind of leftist speak. So I wanted to use this music that a lot of people look at as this revolutionary, radical music, and kind of tell a story about where it really comes from. And I don't want to say debunking its radical roots, but just putting it into perspective. Because another thing that happens, especially in music journalism, is that these people and these moments get almost deified. Like grunge, for example, is a marketing term. It's not a style of music. I don't know what that style of music would sound like, because the bands that come out of that scene sound so dramatically different. If you think about a genre, there's a sound, that would be a sonic through line. And what is that sonic through line for grunge? You could try to say fuzzy guitars, but every band didn't have the same kind of fuzzy guitars, and they really did sound very different. A group like Alice in Chains that comes out of that same Seattle scene, you could easily place Alice in Chains in Los Angeles at the same time. They kind of had more of a LA sound than you would think of the Seattle sound. And if you ask someone what's the Seattle sound, the first thing they're going to say is like Nirvana. But Nirvana really is a punk band. And punk still had a negative connotation to that name. There was still kind of negative iconography to it. People kind of looked at it as kind of almost dumb music, like metal, right? They think of it as dumb people music, heavy metal parking lot. I'm sure you've never seen it, but for people watching the show, Google heavy metal parking lot. It's pretty funny. But anyway, calling it grunge, and the iconography of the artists, right? These guys didn't look like the previous 80s musicians, or the 80s musicians that preceded them with their denim and leather. These guys were, kind of flannel and ripped denim. And that became more of a marker of the sound than the sound itself. Like, for example, grunge, we always say Seattle, but would you call Smashing Pumpkins a grunge band? Because they sound very similar to some of those bands, but they're from Chicago. But not all those bands. The Melvins are from Seattle, and I don't think they sound anything like Soundgarden or Pearl Jam. And I don't think Pearl Jam sounds like Soundgarden. But if you think of, let's say, thrash metal from the 80s and the Bay Area sound, there is a sonic through line. Those guys all played the same amps, the same guitars, were in the same tunings, and they all, I do know their texts. They all had the same tone they were trying to get musically. You don't get that with something like grunge, and it's just a way to market it. And the more I kind of fell into a rabbit hole, I'm writing a new thing right now on hair metal, actually. Even that is a term that in its day, no one called it hair metal. They called it other things. But hair metal becomes the term that sticks. And we look at it through a kind of almost ahistorical lens. And I feel the same way with hardcore punk music and contemporary left politics, that sometimes we look at these things through this kind of made up lens where we just want to make narratives stick, right? Like a lot of people start stuff for Occupy, like everything started with Occupy. And I'm like, were you there? There was a lot of anarchists and anti-vaxxers and, tinfoil hat cats out there. It was really crazy across the board. And I think where we are today, where I start my piece, is the Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump moment. I think that's a big moment for a lot of people. A lot of these shows don't happen until Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump moment. A lot of people don't start saying socialism in a positive light until the Bernie Sanders moment. So that's a big moment for a lot of people. And watching that whole thing happen, I just really wanted to, I don't want to say document it, but I wanted to comment on it by using music, if that's makes any sense.
It's fascinating because learning a lot from older leftists who've been in the game for a while, I often hear of a sort of cycle of leftists where they get either they either become a Democrat or a Republican. Like, you know, if you are a Maoist or an anarchist as a teenager, you're going to become a liberal Democrat. And if you're a Trotskyist or Stalinist, you become a Republican conservative. It's a meme, right? Like, you know, the Trotskyist and neoconservative pipeline. But I mean, there's a kernel of truth to it. But what I found with the Bernie saga is sort of accelerated those developments. Like, you see what has happened with some of the big podcast figures and influencers who popped off in 2016. A lot of them have kind of gone in those cycles, but you know, instead of it being like when you're a lot older, it's accelerated. It's sort of a speed run, you know. And I'm talking about like Red Scare, for example. Red Scare was this like huge podcast that was considered like Bernie Bro adjacent, and they're basically just kind of tradcath conservatives now. And you have like ContraPoints. She's like the most famous quote unquote bread tuber. And yeah, she's basically like, you know, Hillary Clinton went to her house and she's like a Hillary Clinton Democrat at this point. You know, it's very fascinating to see, right? But, you know, what I'm curious about is how is like the shift of punk different from the 60s? Because, you know, I hear all the time a lot of leftists blame what is wrong with the left today on the new left that emerged in the 60s. And you focus more on the punk era. And I find this interesting because that's not discussed as much, I find, by leftists. They always look at the 60s, but not the punk rock. So I'm kind of curious, what were like the main distinctive changes in the punk era in comparison to the 60s? I've heard a lot of this from my mother, my mother is actually technically a boomer, but really came of age in the punk rock era. And she has a lot to say about that. But this is I'm curious though, is someone who's like actually in the scene, you know, making the music, who got to meet your idols. And I guess maybe you've kind of validate the saying that meeting your idols is disappointing, or can be very disappointing or disenchanting.
I'm so glad I got to meet the people that I got to meet. I want to put that in perspective. It's less that I'm disappointed, and it's more that as a young person, I think I put these people on a special pedestal, and getting to know them was extremely insightful because I think the motivations behind what they were doing were less about changing the world and just the same motivations of people in any generation that want to make music, right? You probably just don't want a regular job. Like, let's just be honest. And it's being honest like that that's really hard for people to do, because it doesn't sound cool if you say, "Hey man, I don't want to work. I want to bang on the drum all day, and I want to travel all over the world, and I want to see hot women, and I want to, you know, fly in nice planes." That's a reality that nobody likes to admit, because it takes away from your credentials as being authentic. And that's that culture of authenticity that will tend people, that'll push people to kind of overinflate what they're really doing. Like, if you think you're changing the world through your frickin' song, you are delusional. And I don't think these cats were really that delusional. There's a culture and an industry built around playing to those delusions, those ideas that you're going to change the world, and the world changed when your record came out, and blah, 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 blah. Nuclear war didn't stop, or not war, but, you know, the production of warheads didn't stop because John Lennon made a song, right? So it's foolish to think
The
that you're
FBI
going.
is who killed John Lennon.
Sure.
Don't
I
they
mean, if
say
that's
that?
what you want to believe. If I don't know, if someone said that to
There's a
you,
whole
if you
industry.
don't feel like getting in a fight, just nod and go sure and move on. That's what I do. I'm not trying to, you know, if you want to believe that, you're going to believe that. And I don't think why would they need to kill John Lennon, especially
Because he was, I don't know, but like the
yeah.
evidence that people who say this usually go off of is
Uh-huh.
that like they had there was a FBI file on him, and like
Sure,
they go off
of course.
There's the same guy who wrote the book, The FBI's War on Tupac. I'm kind of forgetting his name at the moment, but he's like this journalist guy, but he also has this other weird ass book slash documentary on like the war. Like he basically thinks the FBI not only, went against famous black leaders like MLK, which is that's
Sure.
known,
Yeah.
but he also throws in like John Lennon, and he throws in all of these 60s musicians, and he throws in Jimi Hendrix there too. He thinks
Sure.
that the FBI had beef with Jimi Hendrix, and it's interesting because I'm like, it's hard to tell to what extent all that is really like the line is blurry,
It's not really, if you think about it, because I'm sure there is files on all those people, but to what extent did they care and need to do anything to derail these people from anything they were doing is the greater question. Jimi Hendrix was more concerned about getting high and banging people than he was with changing the world. And I'm not going to say that same thing about Tupac, but you know, I wouldn't look at him as a quote unquote revolutionary figure. So whatever file you start on him is going to be extremely thin. There's just not much he's doing. So I'm not going to say those things didn't happen because I'm sure they did, but to what extent it was a big time project. The state has their eyes on a lot of people because you just have to what's going on. And after the 60s, I don't think you need to keep your eyes on people that much because neoliberalism really sets in and everybody's their own personal corporation. They're all trying to get famous in their own little way. And that's kind of my question in the mini essay is this music that we look at as so quote unquote revolutionary, is it just a cottage industry that's formed by these people that can't get their foot in the door for mainstream success? Because once they all get an opportunity to get major label record deals, play corporate sponsored venues, get corporate sponsorship, they all do it. I think Fugazi, for the time that they were around, kind of held steadfast to their beliefs, but they don't exist right now in the day and age of Ticketmaster. So would they still be doing what they were doing as far as we're only going to charge, $10 for a ticket, or towards $20 for no more than $20 for a ticket and no more than $10 for a shirt? You might not be able to hold on to those values in an economy that's so monopolized. So you got to bail out of the industry being the truest of the true before the industry really changed. Maybe Ian MacKaye tries to stay true to those core values, but it's just too hard nowadays. There's venues closing left and right because they're getting squeezed out because of ticketing fees. And the bands, some of them speak up about it, but they don't speak up about it from the standpoint of this is monopoly capitalism. It's more like, tell these guys to stop. that's what you got in the 90s with Pearl Jam when they tried to call out the Ticketmaster monopoly. It was kind of like, well, just tell these guys to stop. That doesn't make it go away. It doesn't make things stop altogether. But I do give them a little bit of props for at least trying to call it out. But again, these people aren't quote unquote leftists. They're just musicians. And I don't say that as a disrespectful comment, but they're more concerned with trying to get people to come to the shows and buy the merchandise. Unless you're Bono and you have a fuck ton of money, a lot of money, and you can have your altruistic causes. But even with Bono, he's a very flawed figure because he doesn't understand the full extent of that level of altruism. So,
well, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree with that because it's a very, I think, obvious fact that like music doesn't really change society like that. But what I think is more scathing about your criticisms is that they also apply to the quote unquote real left. A lot of what you're saying about these musicians and their kind of performative radicalism. At some points when you were talking, like I almost forgot you were talking about musicians because it's just equally applicable to a lot of leftists today, when they say like their anti-capitalism boils down to essentially telling the establishment like, stop it, just sloganeering followed by marketing, possibly driven by all too human motives.
That's what's interesting about where we are today, because I think much like with music, people do get into stuff with good intentions, and I don't want to be so pessimistic where I think everybody is just kind of pretending, and that's why I'm not a big fan of the grifter term, because I do think there are true believers. I think there are people that really, first of all, because I know you're 28. If the way you think and see the world now at 28 is the exact same way you see the world at 38, I'm going to think a lot less of you, because that means you haven't lived, you're extremely stubborn, and you think you know everything, right? Your worldview should change as you live life. As your life changes, you're going to get more successful in life. If you think that doesn't change your worldview, you are sadly mistaken. I'm not saying it makes you an ardent capitalist. I'm just saying it changes the way you see the world, sometimes for the better. I have very successful friends that are still leftists, but our views on certain things just mature, if you will. Maybe a change is a bad word. Maybe mature is a better word. And, you know, in music, sometimes people's sound matures. You don't want to do the same record 25 times, right? That's AC/DC. We're just going to that's Slayer. We're going to put out the same record every time. Musically, you're going to mature. Life's going to change around you. And in this world we live in currently, in this political leftist YouTube podcast world, there's a lot of people that believe that they are the vanguard of the revolution through their podcast. And there's other people that are bad actors in the podcast world that are quote unquote sheep herders for said party they don't like. I love that line, because I'm like, maybe so and so just aligns themselves with Democrats because that's the way they see the world. And maybe so and so believes that electoral politics is the only weapon you have to fight power. That could be how they see the world. That doesn't necessarily mean they're getting a check from the Democratic Party. Those two things are extremely different. If you were to sit down with the average person in your city right now and have a conversation about politics with them, they're going to tell you what they are, and then they're going to be all over the board with the way they see the world. Even if you talk to someone, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, blah, blah, blahist, they're going to be all over the place with what they want. And then bigger than that, if you ask them this, so what does that mean? And that's when everybody gets effed up, because it doesn't mean anything. You don't have any power. You're just an army of one. That is neoliberalism personified. All you are is just telling me your brand affiliation. It doesn't mean anything to me. So that's where I get mad about this whole thing. People always want to, well, what are you? I'm Jay.
You're very non-sectarian. That's what I like about your podcast. It's super non-sectarian. That's kind of how I've tried to build mine as well. Because the internet, especially Twitter, they have a tendency of wanting to categorize everybody. I'm not sure if it's, I'm not sure if this is something that always existed with lefty circles, or if it's like I thought it's kind of like a weird, like, internet impulse, like a way to, because on the internet there's just so many people now. Anyone can compete in the marketplace, so that kind of creates an incentive to have yourself stand out, to have greater branding. And the nature of, like, as you said, the nature of ideology in actuality is super contradictory. Like, I like this notion of common sense by Antonio Gramsci, meaning that, like, rather than a doctrine, what we really just have is sort of a bundle of beliefs that come on one end from our upbringing and on the other end from sort of the dominant ideology, and a mix of it. And if you go down to even people who are, like, sophisticated in studying all these ideologies, their ideologies are contradictory too, and that's not really a bad thing. I have beliefs that seem to be very contradictory, and that's actually a complaint actually people have, is that they say, like, oh, One Dime has very contradictory beliefs. One person described me as a liberal conservative Marxist, which I think is interesting because it's kind of accurate in a weird sense, you know? And it's like, like, sure. But, if you look at everyone's beliefs, they're contradictory. And that's, you have to have self-awareness of that. Because if you think you're really, this true doctrinaire Marxist Leninist, it's, no one is that. That's ridiculous. That's just ideology is a way to obfuscate contradiction.
But that's that whole culture of authenticity, right? That's the like I need you to fit into this box. And I think that's even more than that. That's just kind of the way we see the world in this new neoliberal realism of we're all personal corporations. And, like, for example, how many times have you seen someone pass away that might be a famous figure, and people have to release a statement? They may not think of it as releasing a statement. They think of it as posting. It's releasing a statement. Hey, Ass Nugget 47, I really don't care that you care that James Earl Jones died and you have thoughts and prayers for their family. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to release a PR statement about it. But that's kind of where we are, like this idea of canceling, where some people are like, oh, it doesn't really happen, or it does happen. It's like, no, it really does happen. There's people that really try to scold cats that say things that they find don't fit within the orthodoxy of who they believe these people are to be. And I find that problematic when trying to have a real conversation. I want to have a show, excuse me, that is entertaining and insightful. Because if you come hang out with me in Mexico, we're going to hang out and we're going to talk to people, because I'm just always out and about, and we're going to have conversations that'll be entertaining and insightful. Right? And that's fun. That's how you learn. Again, this is how these things kind of help shape your perspective of the world. But it's almost like cats are afraid to have those conversations. If you talk to the average person, you're going to try to call them some sort of name, and they're not going to understand what you're talking about. Like, you are paleo conservative, sir. They're going to be like, I don't know what that means. I just don't like Kamala Harris. Right? Right? So what's really interesting is why these definitions are so short-sighted and useless. If you think about 2020 and how where I live exploded, I won't speak to Canada because I don't know how much people really protested and how bad the protests got during that George Floyd summer. I just don't know. There were all these cries to defund police and end police, and we were talking about mass incarceration, and there were these huge documentaries that everybody was watching about mass incarceration. Everybody wanted to read Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, and that's the only way we had to end police in schools, and all the news reporting was of like rogue law enforcement. Now here we are, just 4 years later. Just 4 years later. And I remember in Oakland, where I'm from, when we were celebrating victories of removing law enforcement from the schools. I'm watching a story about Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where some juveniles beat up some elderly people. And the cry was from the mayor to the governor, I believe, to reinstitute law enforcement in schools. We need more cops in the schools. Just 4 years ago, we were talking about why that was a problem. Because if you get arrested for having a fight, because there was cops in your school, that goes on your permanent record, and you now have a felony as a juvenile. We're seeing more and more laws get rolled back to charge juveniles with capital offenses and throw them under the jail. We're no longer questioning that. We're asking for it in 4 years. I don't care about what you call yourself, because it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. We are complex individuals, and we have a hard time talking to one another because we're so busy speaking from a certain nose in the air perspective of our highfalutin leftist ideologies. That's where I get frustrated and angry and start writing all this stuff at a maddening pace.
Well, you mentioned this distinction between talking to, normal people versus these online people. And I think there's one key material incentive that distinguishes them. And that is when you're online, being a creator, especially a type of creator who is trying to get bigger and, ostensibly make this a full-time living, you have an incentive to you're basically now subject to game theory. Like what the economists who developed game theory think applies to every human, I don't think applies to every human, but it certainly applies to people in competitive market-oriented spaces. And you adopt that psychology when you're in this competitive space. And I think a lot of this in-group policing is ultimately sort of like the same. It's kind of like they want to climb up the hierarchy. They want to get their bounty points. So if they'll jump on the bandwagon when canceling someone, it gives them credibility. It also ensures that they're protected and less likely to, being investigated by the mob. So there's all sort of incentives there. And also, being like, having no sort of stain on your brand, stain on your image. And I noticed this most of all with the bread tube people. Like the bread tube people are the worst with this. Like the type, there is a bread tube like brand. It's a very specific brand, and it's like very safe. It's all about minimizing the amount of human discomfort and suffering, which sounds all great, but it often leads to the fact that you can't even talk about certain things. Or if you talk to a person who has one like problematic view or whatever, even if you don't have that view yourself, you are now enabling them, and you could potentially put that someone in danger by having them here. It's ridiculous. But I think it's like, my theory of it is, this is a kind of like a culture that has emerged out of advertising. That really businesses adopted, and that it's kind of now subjected to, like, the left have uncritically adopted it when they're supposed to be kind of, not subjected to that, but they are very much subjected to that. So they have this like advertising PR logic, which is all about sugarcoating everything and minimizing any kind of negativity. Because, I had this guy called Peter Coffin on my podcast, and I thought he's not that controversial compared to like, someone like, I don't know, the real MAGA com people, which I would have them on too. Like I would want to debate these folks. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? It's like, they're not like Hitlerites, but and I would challenge them. But there's some people who are just against that very idea. If you talk to someone who has some, weird things going on or whatever, and it's like, one of the comments was, you're putting people in danger by talking. It's like, I can see that if they're advocating, the extermination of a group or something.
Who are you putting in danger? Like who particularly is in danger? If you bring, I'm not a fan of those people, right? And my thing is, I want to have an
I think trans people. The people who claim to be representing the trans people, because it's usually not trans people who say this, but it's people who claim to represent. Yeah, they think that if someone has like one gender critical view, that like, that's putting them in danger. And yeah, I don't know. Like the reality is, if you're going to try to talk to normal people, like most normal people, especially older folks, like have those views, you're going to have to kind of be compassionate with them. But I don't know, the left's brand, which is good for its short-term success, or this kind of left's brand, it's good for its short-term success, but it's detrimental for a political project, which requires building coalitions and stuff.
That's kind of the point about the book, right? The cultures of authenticity and deconstruction will work against each other to build any sort of big big coalitions and get yourself into any sort of mainstream thought. So, because part of what you want to do is stay in the underground, and you don't want to admit that, but that is kind of what cats want to do to a certain extent. And when I first heard MAGA communism, I laughed. And then I live near another guy that does what we do, Ben Burgess. He's my neighbor. And he's one of my best friends. And so Ben was debating a cat named Haas. I really feel comfortable that people that are watching this know who that dude is. And I don't like those kind of debates. I think they're a waste of time, because a dude like that's just going to yell over you, and he's going to do it over a screen. He's never going to do it in real life, because it's like, dude, you yell at me again, I'm going to walk over there and punch the shit out of you. Like, don't yell at me. Have a little respect. And the MAGA communism, to me, felt like the end of hair metal. And I'll use the term hair metal so it's a moniker that people can understand. And I'm trying to write this piece on what killed hair metal, because I don't believe grunge killed it. I believe it just died out on its own because it was a marketing term. The original term was like fashion metal. And it was a marketing term that didn't really hit. And the bands that were a part of that era had ditched a lot of the trappings of what we think of as hair metal by 87. And then you get a new wave of people that for some reason are called hair metal, like Guns N' Roses and LA Guns and Skid Row. And these guys didn't have big hair. They didn't have peroxided lead singers, and they didn't have all the outrageous outfits, but they're still called that. And I wanted to ask the question, like, why do you call these people that, especially if there's no sonic through line for these bands? And it was interesting trying to figure that out, because you have to try to write a line. Okay, where does it start? Where does it go? What happened in this band, right? Because you want to make your theory make sense. And when I heard MAGA communism, it just reminded me, there's a documentary by this woman named Penelope Spheres, and you might remember her as a woman that made Wayne's World, if you're familiar with the movie Wayne's World. But she made these 3 documentaries about hardcore punk. And I will say this, because I think it's cool. When I wrote that essay, I sent it to her. I found her email and I sent it to her. And then I made a video essay to accompany it that I had to pull down because I had signed a deal with Means TV. They're going to be airing them all. And she was like, this is right on. I dig it. And I love what you wrote, because it's so true. And she spent years with these people documenting this culture. And the hardcore punk scene kind of dies off in the mid 80s. And the same places she went for her first documentary, all those clubs were filled with these new people with big hair and lipstick on, and all these dudes that were quote unquote dressed like women. And she was fascinated by this. So she made a part 2 to her documentary called Decline of a Western Civilization. And part 2 is called Decline of a Western Civilization, the Metal Years. And it's hilarious because in both documentaries, she talks to just regular people within the scene, aspiring musicians, people that are doing other things in the scene, like trying to have radio shows and trying to throw shows. And by the time she gets to the mid 80s, those DIY people are gone and everyone's just trying to be famous. And when you ask them why they should be, like, why should I care about your band? They're like, because we're dope, but just because I believe in myself, was what they were saying ultimately, which I found fascinating, right? If I have a band, my whole thing is to be dope. If I have a show, I want my show to be dope. I don't want my show to, Jason, why will you succeed? Because I believe in myself and I work harder than everybody else. No, because I'm dope. That's why I love hip hop. Right? Cats, yeah, he's dope. And none of these guys said, because my music is that good. Once you hear it, you'll know. Nobody said it. Nobody said it. And that's MAGA communism to me. Hey, this is hot. it's easier to go this route than to try to write a pop tune. I kind of dig this anyway. And these are two extremely contradictory terms. And I'm going to automatically walk in the door with attention. Go back and look at those early hardcore and punk bands, especially, and I put it, I started with like the Sex Pistols. I'm like, I'm not going to talk about all the proto stuff and the Dolls and the Ramones. You're getting in the weeds. Like, let's just say that hardcore really starts with the Sex Pistols and the bands of the late 70s from the UK, and then by the time it gets to the States, this is what hardcore punk is. That's kind of where I start my thing. And a lot of those bands wore swastikas. That was a thing. Were they Nazis? Maybe a few wanted to be. Were there Nazis in the scene? Sure. But they were taking these images and trying to like flip them on themselves and throw a middle finger to society, because that's the way that generation saw the world. There was one thing they were definitely against. It was like overconsumption, especially from the American perspective. And MAGA communism to me is that, right? I'm going to say I'm MAGA, which is the worst word you can say right now. It is despised. And communism is still a term that is very despisable to rank and file people in North America, kind of throughout the world still. And look at the people that are behind it, right? They get to go on Tucker Carlson. If that's crazy to me. You just made up some BS and a bunch of people just jumped on the train because it sounds cool. That's no different to me than, Sid Vicious wearing a Nazi t-shirt. Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue wearing a swastika armband. That's just
David Bowie,
people,
who I have a shirt of right now, at one point
the
claimed
whole
to be a
fascist
fascist.
thing. Yeah. It's, to some of those people, they're trying to use spectacle. A lot of people are just trying to figure out how I get in the door. And that's how I look at those dudes. They're just trying to figure out how to get in the door and make money. This is a crowded marketplace. It's just too easy to do. You need an internet connection and a BS laptop. If you have a microphone, props. But Michael Moore, the documentarian, started his podcast on a laptop and his AirPods. So if Michael Moore doesn't need a full production setup, then Tony and Jason don't really need that big of a full production setup. It's easy to do. So how do you break through the noise? You just have to be more outrageous than the next guy. And this is a post-jackass world that we live in. So people are very comfortable with being jackasses.
Yeah, like MAGA communism is basically just a I'm very different brand. That's pretty much what it is. Like, it's like, look at me, I'm so polarizing, But what's weird about it is you have, like, at least as far as the leaders of it go, I only know 3 of them. I don't know them personally at all, but like in terms of just knowing who they are, Jackson Hinkle, Haz Aldine, and recently the guy from Midwestern Marks, I think, joined on their party. What's weird about them is, at least, like, they're all kind of different personalities. At least the Haz guy seems to be a very true believer type. Like, he seems almost like, I don't know, he might be on the spectrum or something, but he's like, I've never seen this guy smile ever. He's very serious. He's very serious in what he does. Like, he, I think, believes everything he says. Like, there's something strange about him. Whereas Jackson Hinkle to me seems like a classic slimeball opportunist. Like, just Jackson Hinkle looks like a frat boy who decided that, it was advantageous to him to flirt with communism. And I honestly think Jackson Hinkle might be paid by Russia. Like, not to like go Rachel Maddow mode, but like, I wouldn't be surprised, because it was leaked that a lot of right-leaning YouTubers were backed by Russia, like Tim Pool, they were backed by like a organization that has money from, the Russian state. So I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, like if this is a weird psyop. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a Fed psyop. Or it could just be more boring than that. It could just be like what you said, branding. Yeah. But it's weird because it does remind me of the conspiracies people talk about, how the Feds would infiltrate movements back at the height of 60s radicalism, how they would infiltrate movements, create divisions, sometimes blow up, throw Molotov cocktails at small businesses to, trigger the cops to give an excuse to destroy them. I don't know, like what could be more bad, like a bad look for a left movement that embraces the two most controversial terms in American politics and also is pro-China and pro-Russia, like the two enemies of the American State Department. I mean, like it would give a pretty easy excuse for deportation, if you ask me. So it's like, I don't know if these guys are just stupid or just like, or they're paid actors. It's really hard to tell because they did go in Tucker Carlson, but I'm not sure to what extent that's even like long-term, very successful strat. Like, is it a good strat money-wise, or is it just good for short-term attention?
Like that's the thing. I don't think no one is sitting here mapping this out with a business plan. And that's another thing we have to remember. It's kind of like starting a band. If your band starts with a business plan, your band probably sucks. Or it's a cover band, but then they might suck again because you started out with a business plan. Like that's insane. You get together because you met some people that you jammed with and you guys make some cool tunes, and then maybe you make some songs and you dig the songs and you go out and play them live, and if people dig them, then you write some more and you do it again, and so forth and so on. The podcast world seems to be a way to monetize conversations that people arrogantly think the world needs to hear. And it's just what it is, right? I'm not going to lie and say I don't have a little bit of that in me. I did music for a lot of years. But when I see those guys and everybody gets into the whole, they're paid by this place and that place. And I think you just called it out with the Tim Pool thing. A lot of times if you're being paid by a foreign government, you're not seeing it directly. Russian oligarch isn't necessarily handing you a check directly. The money's going to come through a lot of different ways. And that's just how that shit works. So I think the oversimplification of that kind of stuff, you really have to understand that nuance. Sometimes people just don't know exactly where the money's coming from unless you went somewhere to get said money. There was a moment where I was trying to put together an animated history series. And the first thing I wanted to do was a history on China. It was nothing crazy. It was nothing rah-rah. It wasn't even like rah-rah communism. It was literally just a history from a historian. That historian, though, he's American, but he has affiliations with the Chinese Communist Party. And he was like, look, if you want to get this done, we can get it done. But you're going to get money from this place. And I had a talk with the guys in the Central Committee, as we call ourselves. And it was like, if you're comfortable with people saying you're paid by China, then do it. But I don't think you want to do that. And then none of us are going to feel comfortable if you do that. I was like, all right, then maybe we'll wait on this idea. But it wasn't nefarious and it wasn't even propagandistic. It was, if I could find the file, I would love to show it to you. I was looking for it the other day. It was literally more to try to demystify this idea of China as an evil empire from jump. And it's kind of a way to show that empire, there's the ebb and flow of time. And that's really all it was. Like, hey, it started here. And then, oh no, you had this part where China was really poor. And then all of a sudden it's not. And it was a cool animation that someone did. And then the person that was doing the animation got a little upset with the Uyghur stuff and they didn't want to be a part of it. There was a lot to it, but ultimately I didn't feel comfortable taking money. And you have to be comfortable. If you do this seriously and you start making real money, there's going to be problems with that real money
somewhere along the lines. We talked about sponsorships, right? There's a cereal company that sponsors a lot of people. I forget, Magic Spoon, I think they're called. They, depending on how big you are, they can pay you a decent amount of money for a placed ad. And I was looking into it because our audio podcast actually does numbers good enough where we were starting to get hit up by certain companies. And I saw how much the cereal cost. It's a cereal service, which I thought was the most ridiculous thing ever. A cereal service. Like, you like cereal? Well, we can mail it to you on a bi-weekly basis. At just, it was like $48 a week or it was some crazy number like that. And I was like, there's no way I could feel good about myself as a broke ass cat telling people to sign up for a cereal service. Me personally, I couldn't do it. And I was like, nah, I'm not good with that. You might not feel the same way. Maybe people that listen to one time, like, I want a service for my cereal. I have a service for everything else. Why not? And it's not a knock on you or your character. If for me personally, I was like, I don't know if I could do this. And it really makes you think about the fact that when you start doing these things and things get quote unquote real for you, you're going to be in rooms with people that you might not have been in rooms with before. And, you know, everybody loves a guy like Dave Chappelle until they didn't. And when he won his Mark Twain Comedy Prize, Nancy Pelosi and her husband were there. That's crazy to me. That Dave Chappelle is friends with Nancy Pelosi. Do I think Dave Chappelle is a paid Democratic Party operative? No, I don't. I actually have a very good friend that opens for him. And I think Dave Chappelle is like most people, and his political leanings are all over the place. And he's a person of a certain era who probably thinks of themselves as more liberal than they are, but they're very conservative with their thoughts. So it's the bigger you get, the weirder it gets in certain worlds. And in this world, everybody's, God forbid you had a Jill Stein moment where, like, maybe you were at some sort of function. Like, I have a good friend, I won't say his name. He was at a function and he called me up. He goes, dude, Jordan Peterson is standing right next to me. It wasn't a right-wing thing necessarily, but he lives in LA and he was invited to this shindig, and Jordan Peterson was there and some other people. Someone takes a picture of that. If he was in our world, our podcast world, he'd be done. So-and-so parties with Jordan Peterson. He just happened to be in the same function with Jordan Peterson because someone said, hey, come out to this thing. If all of your friends aren't ardent, like, I'm a leftist, this or this. If you have a rando friend that's like, dude, come with me to this thing, and Jordan Peterson is there, and someone takes a picture of you next to Jordan Peterson, oh man. I mean, I would defend you because I don't think you're a big Jordan Peterson fan, but I know people would just love to crap all over you for that.
I don't know if I've told you, but there's a lot of high-profile YouTubers I know in this city, in Toronto, who I'm friends with. And there's all sorts of lore that I know from them that I could tell you about. And some of it involves actually right-wing personalities. I don't know, I could tell you more in the back room, perhaps, afterwards. Well, we can maybe talk about that a bit. But first, I want to go back to this question about the difference between the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like, particularly the transition from 60s leftism to punk rock radicalism. Because you have this, and how it ties into today, you have this great quote I highlighted here in your book, which I think puts together a lot of your thoughts. And I'll just read it for the audience. You say, quote, In a similar way to which the hardcore punk movement emerged out of the defeat of the New Left, much of the online left and left podcast sphere comes out of the defeat of Bernie Sanders in 2016, and more importantly, 2020. Trump was, in many ways, the type of comic book villain that launched many podcast careers, just as Fear of Reagan inspired so many bands and songs. But what was the unifying bond beyond Trump, beyond Reagan?
I think in the 60s, and I remember talking to Norm Finkelstein about this. I think in the 60s, there's a fear of losing certain middle class securities. So a lot of people are aware, and you have also a lot of liberties. Not everybody has these liberties, right? There is a class of people that have certain liberties to take time off from school, to go join the Peace Corps, or to be part of a movement. I've said this on my show several times. I had an off-air conversation with Fred Hampton's lawyers. They were actually lawyers for the Panthers and I think the Weathermen. And I asked them, do you think this could ever happen again? Where people could graduate, get their law degrees, pass the bar, and then go run off and defend their radical friends. And they both looked at me and went, ooh, no. So you got to think about that for a second when we think about the 60s. We have to always put things into proper context. It's a moment where financially people can say, and the 50s too, I'm a New Yorker, but I don't like what I see in the South, and I'm going to go down there for a summer or a year or until it's done and fight for these people to be able to vote. I'm going to fight to integrate a school, right? Where is the next Bernie Sanders going to come from in that regard? Because that person is knee deep in student debt. And Anand Giridharadas, I think, writes about this very aptly in Winner Take All. If you do go to an elite institution, at best, you want to graduate from that elite institution, get a job at a big consulting firm, and then maybe turn that into something altruistic when you make your gajillions. So that mindset is already just gone of what you could do because of the constraints of capitalism. So the hardcore that comes out of the 80s, there's a very conservative turn that happens post Carter. Reagan's walking in the door like man, kaboom, guess who stepped in the room? And their conservatism is like hardcore. And even to the point where the images that we see in pop culture are real polo shirts and khakis, and that's the look. And like, look at the style of dress in any 80s sitcom or 80s movie. And unless it's at like a disco or something like that, because some of those movies, depending on when you watch them, are at the end of disco. If it's after disco's done, people look like Laura Ingalls Wilder. Conservatism is so strong. So just from the
American
fashion
Psycho,
standpoint,
would you say that's like a good representation of yuppie culture?
yes. Neoliberalism, yes. American Psycho, yes. So, you know, the 80s hardcore movement is really also against this uber consumerism. And I think they're more anti-consumerist than they are anti-capitalists. But that line gets kind of blurred because also communist iconography is about as rebellious as you can get. So having a CCP shirt is like, dude, that guy is hardcore. He's got a CCP shirt. And you're going to wear your SWAT sticker shirt after that. You know, you're letting everybody know that you are just a rebel because you're against this Reaganite conservatism, and you hate these, you know, you hate sitting in front of a television all day long. There's a filmmaker that we got to talk to that was, for me, a blessing, because I watched the film, like seriously watched it much later in life. I watched it maybe earlier this year. It's a movie called Repo Man. And I would advise anyone watching Tony's show to please watch Repo Man. And you're going to have to watch it twice. If you say you picked up everything in that movie the first time, I'm going to call bullshit. And the main character in that movie, played by Emilio Estevez, is this hardcore punk rock kid. He starts off the movie, he quits his job because they're telling him that he's just such a rebel on the job. And he goes home, asks his parents for some money because he has no money now. And his parents are like, we donated your money to a televangelist, which was very popular at the time. So there's some things in the movie that are of its time. But he eventually accidentally gets a job as a repo man. And in one instance, he goes from being hardcore punk rocker, F the establishment, to being part of the establishment. He takes out his earring, and all of a sudden, he's in the system. And I think that's what when you mentioned earlier, how there's a pipeline from Trotskyist to this and that to that. Again, what did that mean if you were these things 20, 30, 40 years ago? Like, really, what did that really mean in the grand scheme of things? And what does it mean to be a Democrat? I don't know what that means. I lived for years with a family that would identify as being Christian and then conservative and then being Republicans. Oh, and they were white. Did I say they were white? They're white. They are white. They're not dead. Wonderful people, lovely people. People are complex creatures that are extremely contradictory. We never got into fights over Jesus in the house. We never got into fights over why Reagan was great. They didn't like some of the right-wing attacks on people like Barack Obama. And they hate Trump. But if I told you those things, they're white, they're Christian, and they're conservative, you would automatically assume that they were, mean people that hated gays and coloreds and all these other things and anti-abortion and this, that, and the other. And it's like, no, not necessarily. And that's one of those things that kind of shows you too that people are complex in the way that you identify yourself. Like, who is that for and what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? And we lose that, I think, in these worlds that we live in, because we're constantly trying to identify people. And the people watching our shows, sadly, are constantly trying to identify who we are and where they can put us in the shows that they consume for their quote unquote political education, which really just means entertainment.
Yeah, that's a lot there. I wasn't sure if so with the I guess what differentiates maybe the punk rock leftism, as we could maybe call it, from 60s leftism is that in many ways it's like punk rock leftism is the 60s left without the movement. Like, you could say that 60s leftism was kind of incoherent already and had a lot of similar tendencies, but there was a movement undeniably. Like, there just was, even if what unified it was kind of all over the place. Like, like what we call the new left spans, the civil rights movement, ranging from that to the Black liberation movement, all the way to the hippies, which like are completely disconnected. But we tend to like put all this together, as well as with the student movements. But it's still like a movement, and it's definitely something like the establishment, rightfully or incorrectly, was very afraid of to a certain extent, at least at a certain point in time. But I see like punk rock leftism is it takes a lot of that protest culture, but it's without the movement. So instead of a crowd, you get like a swarm, a swarm of individuals. And I think that's heightened by social media, especially.
It sees the protest as the movement, as the victory, as the everything, right? Because that's the images that it came up seeing. Oh, they protested. Someone put a flower in a gun, and that's what stopped the Vietnam War. So there's kind of a understanding of, well, this is the way things change. And I do want to say this about punk rock. I love the music and the culture because there's something about DIY that just really resonated with me because I didn't have a lot growing up. And being able to take what you have and be able to do cool stuff with it and be able to have a community of people that want to help you is a beautiful thing. So I never want this to come off like I'm just shitting all over everybody in the scene and the culture and think they're all silly and stupid and blah, 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 blah. It's more of a critique. To me, it's more of a love letter. It is through these wonderful people that I was able to do music for so long. And it's through these wonderful people that I was able to play 100 to 150 shows throughout North America and certain parts of Europe and never have to pay for a room and had a floor or a couch or spare bedroom to sleep on. There's something to be said about the camaraderie in some of these scenes that we find. But on that same hand, I saw a lot of gatekeeping. If you didn't fit in within the orthodoxy of what they thought was cool, and then what people thought was punk rock, I thought was like just debaucherous behavior. Like I don't understand why that is cool, but I just want to say that because I think that's really important because I think sometimes people misconstrue where I'm coming from and the people in the scene, legends in the scene have done tremendous things to make sure I was able to stay on the road or even fix equipment, give me equipment. So there's something about that scene when you're a part of it to that level that it's a beautiful thing. But I think sometimes that intimacy that one has, you think that's the entirety of everything, and you kind of miss why there's some problematic aspects to what we love. Like, why can't there be somebody in here with a preppy outfit on? Not everybody's a freaking op. Why can't they dig what we do as well? Why don't you want them to dig what we do? So I think that's the problematic aspect of it. Like, I try not to do a show that is alienating to quote unquote normies. And maybe that's my problem. Maybe if I was said bigger
That's why
words
you
all the
start off the
time.
pod with Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, and Lenin with like hardcore with metal. I love that intro.
Yeah.
I love that intro, by the way, but it
Thank
gives the impression that you're like way more like hardcore Marxist Leninist than you actually are.
Probably, but the only way you could find that out if you sat down and talked to me. And dude, when we hang up, I'm gonna go downstairs into a bar filled with people that are gonna have crazy political opinions, and for some reason, they're gonna talk to me about crazy stuff. Trump, homeless people, Kamala Harris. I'm gonna hear it all when I walk into that bar, right? And I'm probably going to explain it to them with sports metaphors. So I have a sports show because I can talk about left politics through sports.
It is sports. It's team sports.
It is for a lot of people. Sadly, it is for the people that watch what we do. It's only team sport. It's worse than team sports, brother. It's TMZ for a lot of people. So and so is a sheep, or so and so is a this. I was like, man, I don't give a damn. I'm on air right now. Don't be on this chat talking about another show, guys.
But even geopolitics, like the way people talk about this fantasy of BRICS, like as if it's a unified bloc against America. You have these leftists who believe in this fantasy that, China, Russia, and Brazil and, Iran are all united against the US when they, in fact, were kind of all opposed to each other, really. And you only started seeing collaboration after the Ukraine war. And that's kind of led to a whole new team sports, which is like, they see Russia getting Ukraine is like, yeah, down with Western hegemony, like as if that's going to affect anything. And it's, it's fascinating. Like you're in your basement typing, talking about how great China's rail is. Like, they don't care. No one here, that's not going to do anything. But, so much of like Marxist Leninists online, that's what it boils down to. It's regime enjoying. It's like being a mascot for a country that you don't live in.
And isn't that weird? I find it weird, and I find part of me finds it a little fascinating that people are like that. This horror movie that I saw, it's called Late Night with the Devil. I don't know if you're a horror fan. It's a really good movie. I really dug it. But there's this character in it that is a big pessimist on what he's seeing, and I'm gonna do this movie no justice. You have to watch it for yourself, and I will spoil everything. Because if you haven't seen it by now, I don't care. But at the end, this pessimistic character shows who he really is, and he's kind of a follower of Satan and drops to his knees, and gives his allegiance to the devil, who then blows him up. And I feel that way for a lot of these people with their allegiances to these countries. Not to say these countries are all the devil, but there's just this weird like America bad. And that's just your whole politics is America bad. But you really want to just pledge allegiance to the Russian Federation. And I find that weird. Like, why? Because it's not the CCP. And the dude heading it, not a fan of the CCP. So why would you think that what you see is some sort of throwback to the Soviet Union? I don't know. I don't get that. But I think that goes with people having really overly simplistic views of the world and sitting in this America bad. And that's it. And it's easy. It's like sports. You don't have to ever play the game or know that much about it to say someone sucks if they throw an incomplete pass or a guy misses a jump shot or someone's having a slump at the plate, right? You don't have to know that much about it. You just have to be shocking with the way you talk about that person. And that's the way I see a lot of these political shows that you're talking about that shall remain nameless.
So there's this way in which the 60s is depicted by my mother, which I'm curious to get your take on, and like the difference between 60s and punk rock. So she was a child, essentially like a kid during the 60s hippie period, and came of age, was a teenager, 20s throughout the punk rock period. And she kind of depicts it as if the punk rock period was sort of a reaction to the narcissism and phoniness of the 60s. Like that's how she felt at the time. Like, because at the time, there was this movement towards liberation, man, the revolution, the cultural revolution. That's something a lot of people always would use, the cultural revolution. And she saw, and you have the rise of these ideas like polygamy and, kind of stuff. And she said, like, this is just a bunch of like bullshit for like white people to get, like white dudes to get laid, That's how she depicted it. And I found that pretty funny. And how like a lot of the 60s was like everyone was trying to be so deep and everyone was trying to act like they were on this wave of, having a new consciousness. At least this is when like 60s culture becomes more mainstream, like sort of the end of the 60s. And she sees like punk rock culture as like a sort of just, a rebellious attempt to be like, tear it all down, like, fuck it, like sort of, it's just a more nihilistic evolution of a similar phenomenon, but felt more authentic at the time. It seems, and perhaps, kind of repeated the same cycle as it became more mainstream.
I wish your mom was here. I'd like to pick her brain and ask her some questions. I'm being totally serious. Again, I wasn't alive in the 60s. I'm born in 77, but I did hang out with a lot of those guys. Actually, one of my good friends, Kid Candelario, worked for the Grateful Dead before they were the Grateful Dead, when they were doing the Ken Kesey acid test. And he worked for them from then all the way up to the point Jerry Garcia died. He helped build the Wall of Sound. He still makes cables and pedal boards for some decent sized bands to this day. But I mean, you want to talk about picking somebody's brain. I spent a lot of time listening to kids' stories of 60s debauchery, and I won't say any of these on your main show. There is one funny story that I will tell in the other side if you want. I think it's funny.
Oh, yes.
But I do think this is the thing with the hippies. The hippies got to be adjacent to all these things that you were talking about, right? Hippies got to be adjacent to civil rights, quote unquote, black liberation. They get to be adjacent to American Indian movements. They get to be adjacent, and they pick up a lot of that. Everything that we call cultural appropriation now, which we don't have to have that conversation, the hippies were doing, and it was looked upon as like radical, right? Headdresses and wearing native moccasins and all that shit, right? They got to be women's rights and liberation. They get to be close to all that stuff. And I wouldn't be so flippant as to say that every single person of that era wasn't a part of it, but I will say everybody that threw a peace sign up and then had those clothes on, I won't say all of them were hippies and were righteous. Some people, just like every person that had an afro and a black leather jacket wasn't a Black Panther. Their membership was not that large. So if you think about Woodstock, that is 60s marketing chef's kiss. Woodstock is a massive financial failure. As I've worked in large music festivals, Coachella, EDC, Bottle Rock, and I worked at it from a back end perspective. I wasn't like a crew member. I was actually a guy doing reports and doing financial stuff. And everything I've ever heard about Woodstock, read about Woodstock, I'm like, how did that even happen? How do you move a location 2 weeks before? That doesn't happen. You cancel that thing because you don't have a spot. And actually, the last thing that I was supposed to work on before I left that industry was the 30-year anniversary, or the 50-year anniversary of Woodstock. That never happened because they didn't sell enough tickets. But anyway, Woodstock is a huge failure. And the only thing that helps those guys make money is they had a film crew that was recording everything. And they made the Woodstock movie. And there's a lot of images from the Woodstock movie that people think about as like these magical images of that era. So Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner, I believe, is the last day. Woodstock had estimated 300,000 plus people. No one knows how many people were there because they sold a very small amount of pre-sale tickets, and they were going to take tickets at the door. Before they can even get people there to take tickets, cats had broke through the gate and got there for free. And they were planning to stop everybody and take $5 from them because they knew those people came there with money. Food vendors couldn't get in, and there was a portable toilet for all those people. Think about this for a second. When you move locations last minute, you're dealing with massive amounts of power, right? People forget this. Festivals aren't magical solar things. There's a lot of power. It rained. People almost died. The state had to come in and save them. As far as like helicoptering people in and out. But anyway, this image of Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner, they always cut tight on Jimmy. And you never see the crowd. You know why you never see the crowd? Because everybody left. There might have been 10,000 people there to see that. Everybody left. That's not how, when you say that, it sounds weird. If I told you that there were sexual assaults at 69 Woodstock, you'd be like, what? Yeah. In 1969,
That's not
I believe
surprising at all.
The pill
that was very prevalent in 60s culture because they were all like, if a woman didn't want to, do it with them, they would be like, "Aren't you liberated? Be liberated,
but there was
man. Be liberated, man."
Keep in mind, Tony, there's a pill that's going to keep this woman from becoming pregnant. And for a lot of people, men, that pill was an implied yes. So as we see images of people having sex and we think this is the free love era, we automatically eliminate the fact that some women just might not have wanted to fuck that stinky guy with a matted ass afro. And if you were reporting a rape in 1969, there's this wonderful narrative, and I say wonderful extremely with my tongue implanted in my cheek, about Woodstock 99. That, because I think there's like 4 reported sexual assaults. Everyone goes, there was more. Women just didn't speak up. Sure. Sure. It's hard to speak up in 2024. Of course, it's going to be hard to speak up in 99, 69, and 09. It's going to be hard. Why do we think there wasn't more in 69? There was reports in 94. No one ever talks about the 94 Woodstock. And the same thing happened in 94 that happened in 69. Cats broke through the fence and went for free. These people that did Woodstock, 4 months later, do Altamont, same failure. But we look at them as these purveyors of the culture, of cool, of everything that is liberating about 60s, and we don't look at them as failed businessmen. Because they were able to market this as the success of boomer greatness. And on one hand, you kind of got to give it to them. It's like, man, you guys marketed failure better than anyone I've ever seen in my life. Where people literally die at your festivals every time you have one. And you can just overlook that with this.
Dude, it sounds like the Travis Scott Festival. I don't know if you heard
Oh,
about that.
God. Yeah, or that too. I mean, I'm not laughing. People died at them. It's like a couple people died there. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
they didn't measure at all like how many people were gonna be there, and just people suffocated because there were just way too many people. It's fucked.
If you don't know what you're doing, it's very dangerous to try to do stuff like this. And with Woodstock, when those people broke through, the guy he's passed away recently, he was like, just let them in, man. He goes, we're gonna have a riot on our hands if we try to charge these people after they're already in. They're coming through the gate. We can't do anything about that. The merchandising post Woodstock is massive for them. They made an Altamont movie too, because they're like, this is the only way we're going to make money off this stuff is we make movies and document this crap. By the time 99 happens for them, they think they have the solution to the previous problems, which is we've figured out how to contain people. We figured out how to have proper sewage and bathrooms. But what happened was capitalism happened in 1999. People couldn't get supplies in and out, and if you did bring enough food to sell, then you charged triple the amount of money because you could. There were no caps on that. Now there's caps on stuff like that. You can't just do that at a festival. And Paul Toilette did the first Coachella a few months after Woodstock 99. And where the first Coachella actually lost money, he took a map of a location from a Nickelodeon live event, and he figured that this was the best way to do a live event. If you have this much space and you put stages here and you put commerce here, then that's the best way for it to work. They tried that in 99. It didn't work the way they wanted it to, and Coachella figured it out. And now I think Coachella is the cultural event of a generation. It's younger people's Woodstock, if you will, that is literally not about music and all about commerce, as someone that's worked there for several years.
Yeah, I think we have way too much behind the scenes stuff not to go in the back room right now. I'm realizing that there's just so much you're itching to say, but don't want to say it. I notice you're very restrained on your pod, but that's what the back room's all about. And if you're not part of the back room already, if you're not a patron already, I mean, you're living under a rock. Instead of spending $5 on a goddamn Starbucks latte, you can spend only $5 an entire month and get access to the whole back room catalog. So without further ado, I'll see you there. And thank you for being on the show, Jason. It's always a pleasure. Any final things you want to say and plug? Aside from your book, of course.
Oh, yeah, dude, totally check out the book. I'm working on another book that actually takes this idea and expands it way further with my good friend, Professor Dr. Alexander Herbert, who actually does have a book. He has the only history of punk in the Soviet Union documented. It's in the Library of Congress, and
I'd be
Alex and I are
fascinated
working on
to
a
learn
book.
about that.
It's dude, you should. He made a documentary. He just recently went back to Georgia and Tbilisi, and did a documentary series on the kind of influx of Russians because of the war in this area and how it's affecting music scenes. It's really cool. But he actually did a lot of interviews for his book with cats that were a part of that 80s punk scene. And when you find out about how crazy it was, it's like listening to them talk about their scene and how the state infiltrated it, and how hard it was just to get instruments, and hearing people complain about like infiltration in our world. It's like, dude, shut up. No one, there is nothing we have to that level. I'm definitely working on that. I'm going to finish in the next few weeks this documentary series that I've been working on for the last 2 years called Kayfabe. The way we interact with news media, I think, is the way that we interact with pro wrestling. And I made a really cool documentary series with a young man around your age, where it's kind of our video essay style, where we take clips and I narrate it. But it's going to be a multi-part series. It was going to be one thing, and that's what's taking so long right now. We're chopping it up into episodes. But we start with like the rise of cable news media and the rise of Vince McMahon. They actually happen around the same time. So it's actually pretty interesting. And we use wrestling terminology to help people understand how we watch news media today. And other than that, I think everybody should be a patron of Tony's show. The amount of work that goes into what he does is tremendous, and I appreciate the work that he does. And I've been a fan of it since I caught a video a few years ago. And I was like, whoever this cat is, he's doing some ill stuff. So I'm glad I've gotten to know him and see him grow. And as I always say, I'm always excited to see how you grow over the years. I'm going to sit back here rocking in this chair with nothing but joy and glee as I see you climb certain ladders of success.
Well, flattered. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure talking to you. And check out This Is Revolution podcast. Yeah, I'll see you in the back room, Jason.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.